The last known photograph of Michael Brennan shows him standing at the trailhead of the Hoh River Trail, Olympic National Park, August 14th, 1989. He's wearing a red flannel shirt, his backpack straps cutting into his shoulders, and he's smiling. That crooked, half-embarrassed smile he always gave cameras. Behind him, the cathedral of Sitka spruce and western hemlock rises into perpetual mist. The ranger who took the photo said Michael asked about the deepest, quietest parts of the rainforest. Somewhere nobody goes, he'd said. He was 23 years old, a forestry student from Oregon State. He had a field journal, a 35mm camera, 2 weeks of supplies, and a permit for backcountry camping. He was supposed to return August 28th. He never did. I'm Sarah Brennan. I was 19 when my brother disappeared. I'm 53 now. For 34 years, I've been searching for answers in a case that was quietly, systematically buried, not because there was no evidence, but because the evidence was unacceptable. This isn't a story about closure. I haven't found that. This is a story about what happens when witnesses tell the truth and the system decides that truth is too uncomfortable to document. When 3 separate hikers, 2 park employees, and 1 county deputy all mention the same thing, and suddenly, files get reclassified. Interviews become unavailable. Search operations end without explanation. The official conclusion: Michael Brennan became disoriented in the wilderness and perished due to exposure. Probable animal predation. Case closed in 1991, but I've read the original witness statements, the ones that were later redacted. I've tracked down the people who were told to stop talking. I've matched their descriptions against decades of similar incidents across the Pacific Northwest. Incidents that follow a pattern, a signature, a presence that exists in the margins of official reality. My brother didn't get lost. He encountered something. And when people tried to report what they saw, what they heard in those woods in the weeks following his disappearance, they were met with silence, skepticism, and eventually, institutional suppression. This is what I've learned. This is what they didn't want documented. Some silences aren't natural. They're enforced. The first 48 hours were textbook. Olympic National Park rangers initiated standard search protocols. Dogs, helicopters, ground teams radiating out from Michael's last known location. The weather had been stable. No storms, no flash floods. Temperature in the low 60s. These weren't conditions that swallowed experienced hikers. I arrived on August 30th with my parents. We stayed at a motel in Forks, that gray logging town where rain sounds like static, and everyone knows the forest takes people sometimes. The rangers were professional, cautious with promises. The Olympic wilderness is vast, they said. 375 miles of trails, but 1 million acres of unmapped terrain. By day 5, they'd found his campsite. 11 miles in, just off trail, nestled in a grove of old-growth cedar. His tent was still standing. Sleeping bag laid out but unused. The campfire had been built but never lit. Kindling arranged in perfect formation. Matches beside it, untouched. His backpack hung from a bear cable. Food cache intact. Nothing disturbed. But Michael wasn't there. His camera was missing. So was his field journal. But his wallet, his ID, his car keys, all remained in the backpack's front pocket. People don't leave their campsites voluntarily without those things. They especially don't leave food hanging in bear country and walk away. The search expanded. Dive teams checked the Hoh River. Technical climbers rappelled cliffs. Volunteers walked grid patterns through Devil's Club and sword fern so thick you couldn't see 3 feet ahead. I walked those grids myself, calling his name until my voice cracked, scanning the moss-covered forest floor for any trace. A footprint, a piece of clothing, a sign. On day 9, they found his camera, 2 miles northwest of his camp, in a drainage ravine near Elk Lake. The camera body was shattered, film exposed to light, but the strap was intact. It lay on top of the leaf litter, not buried, as if placed there recently. The ranger who found it, a young woman named Teresa Marsh, said something about the location bothered her. "It's not where someone would fall," she told me quietly, away from the official debrief. "And it's not on any logical route from his camp. It's like it was brought there." I asked what she meant. She glanced at the senior rangers nearby and lowered her voice. The ground around it was disturbed, but not by human boots. That was September 1st. The search continued another week, then scaled back. By late September, it was officially suspended pending new evidence. We were told Michael had likely suffered an accident, possibly a fall into water, and his body was carried away by the river or scavenged by wildlife. The missing journal and destroyed camera were consistent with animal interaction, but I couldn't leave. I stayed in Forks. I interviewed everyone, rangers, volunteers, local guides. I walked the trails myself, carrying copies of Michael's photo, asking everyone I encountered if they'd seen him, heard anything, noticed anything unusual. That's when the pattern started to emerge. A logger named Bill Hutchins told me he'd been working a site 5 miles west of the Hoh River Trail in mid-August. Heard screaming one night, he said. Not human, not elk, not cougar, something deeper. Carried across the valley like a foghorn. Made the hair on my neck stand up. Next morning found tree branches broken about 10 feet up. No bear does that. A hiking couple from Seattle, the Kowalskis, had been camping at Hoh Lake on August 23rd. We heard something large moving through the brush around midnight, Mrs. Kowalski said. We assumed it was an elk, but then we smelled it. This overwhelming rancid odor, like rotting meat and wet dog. And whatever it was breathing. Standing just beyond our tent. We didn't move. We barely breathed. After maybe 10 minutes it walked away. Heavy, bipedal footsteps. A park employee named David Chen, who worked trail maintenance, mentioned finding tracks. August 27th, near the Junction Trail. Barefoot prints, but they were huge. At least 16 inches long, maybe more. 5 clear toes. I photographed them, reported it. My supervisor told me to delete the photos and forget it. Said tourists were making fake prints all the time and we didn't need to encourage hysteria. I asked if he'd deleted them. He hadn't. He showed me. The prints were clear, pressed deep into mud. The stride length was over 6 feet. Whatever made them was massive and walking upright. Each interview added another piece. Strange vocalizations, impossible tracks. The smell, sightings of something tall and dark moving between trees. And a consistent detail. These encounters clustered in the 2 weeks surrounding Michael's disappearance, all within a 10-mile radius of his last known location. I compiled everything into a binder. Witness statements, photos, maps with marked locations. I brought it to the park superintendent's office in October 1989. I was told, politely but firmly, that anecdotal reports of wildlife behavior were not relevant to the investigation. That rumors about unidentified animals were common in wilderness areas and reflected misidentification, not evidence. That I was grieving, and grief could make patterns appear where none existed. I asked why David Chen was told to delete his photos. The superintendent said he had no knowledge of that incident. I asked why Teresa Marsh's observation about the camera's placement wasn't in the official report. He said all relevant findings were documented. I left that office knowing something was wrong. Not with the forest, with the response. Winter came. The case grew cold officially, but I couldn't let it freeze. I worked part-time at a Forks diner, lived in a rented room above the hardware store and spent every free hour researching. The local library became my archive. I read everything. Historical accounts of the Olympic Peninsula, native histories, old newspaper clippings about missing persons. The pattern was older and wider than I'd imagined. In 1974, a bow hunter named Raymond Cole vanished in the same general area, found 3 weeks later, incoherent and dehydrated, 12 miles from where he'd disappeared. He told authorities he'd been followed and watched by something that walked like a man but wasn't human. His hunting bow was never recovered. The report classified him as psychologically unstable due to exposure. In 1982, 2 forestry workers reported finding a shelter made of woven branches near Bogachil River, constructed in a dome shape, too large for human occupancy, smelling of animal musk. They photographed it. The photos were confiscated by their employer and never made public. In 1987, just 2 years before Michael disappeared, a female backpacker named Jennifer Ortiz reported being escorted out of the deep forest by something she never fully saw. She'd gotten disoriented off-trail, and as night fell, she heard footsteps pacing her. Heavy, deliberate, maintaining distance. It kept me moving toward the trail, she said, like it was hurting me. When I finally reached the main path at dawn, the footsteps stopped. I turned around and saw a shape between the trees, tall, watching. Then it just melted back into the forest. Her report was filed under Wildlife Encounter, Probable Elk. Every incident followed the same script. Credible witness, specific details, immediate dismissal. I started reaching out to people listed in these old reports. Many didn't want to talk. Some had been explicitly instructed not to, but a few did. Raymond Cole, the 1974 hunter, was 71 when I found him in 2003. He lived in Port Angeles, hadn't been back to the Olympics since his experience. They told me I was crazy, he said, hands shaking slightly as he poured coffee. But I know what I saw. It was following me for 3 days. Never came close, but always there. When I finally collapsed from exhaustion, I woke up near a trail I'd never seen before. Something moved me there. I don't know why. I asked what he thought it was. He looked at me with tired, certain eyes. Something that lives there, has always lived there. Something smart enough to know when to help and when to hide. Jennifer Ortiz had become a wildlife biologist. I found her in 2005, working for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. She was reluctant at first, but when I mentioned Michael, something shifted in her expression. Your brother, she said quietly. I heard about that case. I tried to come forward back then. I called the tip line, told them about my experience 2 years earlier in the same area. I explained that maybe he'd encountered the same thing I had, that maybe it wasn't hostile. Maybe he was alive somewhere, disoriented but accompanied. What happened? I asked. The ranger who took my call said they'd follow up. No one ever did. A week later, my supervisor got a call from someone in the Park Service. He pulled me aside and said I needed to stop making unhelpful statements about the Brennan case, that I was spreading misinformation that could hamper search efforts. I was 26, I was scared for my job, so I shut up. Do you still believe what you experienced was real? I don't believe. I know. And I think your brother encountered it too. But Sarah, she hesitated. There's a reason they shut these things down. It's not a conspiracy. It's institutional self-preservation. If the Park Service acknowledged that something unidentified and potentially dangerous lives in the Olympics, they'd have to close huge sections of the park, or admit they can't guarantee visitor safety. Either way, it's catastrophic for tourism, funding, public trust. So the alternative is simpler. Deny, deflect, discredit. I met with David Chen again in 2007. He'd left the Park Service years earlier, now worked as an environmental consultant. He was more willing to talk freely. I saw those tracks again, he said, 3 more times over the years before I quit, always in remote areas, always after reports of missing people or strange encounters. And every time, same thing. Report it, get told to forget it, watch the incident get classified as bear activity or hiker error. Did you ever see one? I asked. The creature itself? He was quiet for a long time. Then, once, 1996. I was doing a solo survey in the Kino Valley, heard something behind me, turned around and there it was, maybe 40 yards away, partially obscured by cedar trunks, 8 feet tall, easily, covered in dark hair, broad shoulders. It was just standing there, watching me. I froze. We stared at each other for maybe 20 seconds. Then it turned and walked away. Not fast, not slow, just walked. Like it had decided I wasn't interesting. What did you feel? Not fear. That's what surprised me. I felt observed. Like when you're in a museum and you realize the security guard has been watching you the whole time. It was intelligent. I could feel that. And it chose to leave. That wasn't an animal reacting on instinct. That was a decision. These conversations changed something in me. I'd started this search looking for Michael's body, for closure, for answers that fit conventional understanding, but I was finding something else, a persistent, intelligent presence in the Olympic wilderness that existed in the gap between official acknowledgement and lived experience, and I was finding evidence that institutions knew about it and actively suppressed that knowledge. The breakthrough came in 2010, 21 years after Michael disappeared. I received an envelope in the mail, no return address, postmarked from Sequim, Washington. Inside was a photocopy of an official Clallam County Sheriff's Department report, dated September 8, 1989. The reporting deputy was listed as D. Patterson. The incident classification was listed as suspicious activity, possible endangered person. The report had been stamped, closed, no further action, and then sealed by court order in red ink. Someone had gone through considerable risk to get this to me. The report detailed an incident I'd never heard about. On September 7, 1989, during the active search for Michael, Deputy Dale Patterson responded to a call from a hunting camp approximately 8 miles northeast of where my brother's camera had been found. 2 hunters, Marcus Webb and Tom Galloway, reported hearing distressed human vocalizations the previous night and discovering evidence of possible struggle the following morning. Deputy Patterson arrived at 10:47 a.m. In his report, he noted finding a small clearing where the ground was significantly disturbed, branches broken, undergrowth trampled, soil torn up as if something heavy had been dragged. He observed what he described as unusually large barefoot impressions, humanoid in shape but exceeding normal human dimensions, 17 inches in length, with a stride of approximately 7 feet. The hunters reported that around 2:00 a.m., they'd heard what sounded like a man shouting, not words but distressed vocal sounds, possibly indicating fear or pain. They'd also heard responsive vocalizations, deeper, resonant calls that seemed to answer the human-like sounds. Like communication, Webb told the deputy, like something was responding to whoever was yelling. They'd been too frightened to investigate in darkness. At dawn, they found the clearing. They also found something else. A torn piece of red fabric snagged on a vine maple branch about 7 feet off the ground. Red flannel, like the shirt in Michael's last photograph. Deputy Patterson collected the fabric, photographed the tracks, and took detailed statements from both hunters. He noted in his report that the fabric appeared recently deposited, and that the disturbance in the clearing was inconsistent with typical wildlife activity. He recommended immediate notification of National Park Service search teams and possible forensic analysis of the site. His report concluded, based on physical evidence and witness testimony, investigating officer believes this incident may be connected to missing person Michael Brennan. Recommend urgent follow-up with NPS and search coordination. According to the photocopied report, Deputy Patterson submitted it to his watch commander on September 8th. A handwritten note at the bottom, dated September 9th, read, "Discussed with NPS Superintendent Reynolds. Evidence evaluated. No connection to Brennan case established. Close report." The fabric was never mentioned in any official search documentation I'd received. The hunter's statements were never included in the case file. Deputy Patterson's photographs were never logged into evidence. It was as if it had never happened. I tracked down Marcus Webb in 2011. He was still living in Washington, working as a contractor in Bremerton. When I called and mentioned the 1989 incident, there was a long silence. Then, I wondered if anyone would ever ask about that. We met at a diner in Silverdale. Webb was in his 60s now, weathered and straightforward. "Tom died in 2004, he said first. Heart attack. He never talked about that night either. We both learned to keep our mouths shut. I asked him to tell me what really happened. Everything in that deputy's report was accurate," Webb said. "But there was more. When we heard those sounds, the human voice and the other voice, Tom wanted to go look. I stopped him, because whatever was out there, it was big. We could hear it moving through the brush, trees cracking, heavy footfalls, and that smell, Jesus, that smell, like a bear den mixed with rotten salmon. The red fabrics, it was on the branch when we found the clearing, but there was something else too. In the center of all that disturbed ground, there was a depression, like something had been laid there, and around it those massive prints, circling like whatever made them had been standing around. I don't know, standing vigil, examining something. You think my brother, I think your brother encountered something in those woods. And I think whatever it was, it reacted. Maybe defensively, maybe protectively, I don't know. But the way that clearing looked, the way the prints circled that spot, it felt like aftermath, like something had happened there that we weren't equipped to understand. I showed him the photocopied report. This was sealed, hidden. Why? Webb shook his head. 2 days after we gave our statements, the deputy came back to our camp. Different guy with him. Didn't introduce himself but had federal credentials. They sat us down and explained very clearly that our statements had been evaluated and determined to be unreliable, that we'd likely heard elk vocalizations and misinterpreted normal wildlife signs. They strongly suggested we not repeat our story to anyone, especially media, said it would interfere with the legitimate search effort. And you agreed? We were scared. Not of the thing in the woods. Of them. The way they looked at us like we were problems to be managed. Tom and I talked about it later. We realized we'd seen something they didn't want acknowledged. So we kept quiet. I'm sorry. I wish we'd pushed harder. I asked if he'd ever gone back to those woods. Once, he said. About 10 years ago. Hiked back to that same area with GPS. Wanted to see if I could find the clearing again, see if there was anything else. I found the spot. The trees had grown, but the geography was right. And you know what? There were still tracks. Old ones weathered but visible in dried mud near a creek. Same size, same pattern. Whatever lives there, it's still there. The sealed report opened new doors. If a court order had been issued to suppress Deputy Patterson's findings, there was a paper trail. Court orders don't materialize from nowhere. Someone requested it. Someone argued for it. Someone signed it. I hired a lawyer in 2012, a young public interest attorney named Rachel Kim, who specialized in FOIA requests and government transparency. She was intrigued by the case, partly because of its complexity, and partly because she'd grown up in Seattle hearing Bigfoot stories, and had always wondered about the disconnect between folklore and official denial. If federal agencies are involved in suppressing evidence related to a missing person case, Rachel said, that's a serious civil rights issue. We have grounds to request everything. We filed Freedom of Information Act requests with multiple agencies, National Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, FBI, and even the Department of the Interior. We requested all documents related to Michael Brennan's disappearance, all communications between agencies regarding the case, all evidence collected but not publicly disclosed, and all records of witness testimony. The responses took months. When they came, they were heavily redacted. The National Park Service provided a sanitized case file, the same information I'd already received in 1989, with a few administrative memos about search logistics. Nothing about Deputy Patterson's report, nothing about the red fabric, nothing about the hunter's statements. The FBI responded that they had no records related to Michael Brennan. The Department of the Interior's response was more interesting. They acknowledged having documents related to the case but claimed they were exempt from disclosure under FOIA Exception 7A, interference with law enforcement proceedings. Rachel immediately flagged this. There are no active law enforcement proceedings, she said. Your brother's case was closed in 1991. This exception doesn't apply unless there's something ongoing they're not telling us. We appealed. The appeal was denied with additional justification. Documents contain information that, if disclosed, could reasonably be expected to endanger life or physical safety of individuals. Rachel looked at me after reading that denial. Sarah, they're saying that releasing information about your brother's case could endanger someone's life, 23 years after he disappeared. That's not a standard denial. That's a specific active concern. They're protecting something, I said, or someone. Or something. We pushed further. Rachel connected with other attorneys who'd handled similar cases, missing persons in wilderness areas where witness testimony mentioned unexplained phenomena. We discovered a pattern of federal intervention. Cases in the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, Montana, and Alaska, where initial reports contained references to large bipedal creatures, unusual tracks, or anomalous encounters, and were subsequently sealed, reclassified, or had evidence mysteriously disappear from custody. One attorney based in Spokane told us about a 1998 case in Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. A hiker disappeared. Multiple witnesses reported seeing something large and upright in the area. Forest Service initially investigated, then suddenly closed the case. The family sued for negligence. During discovery, the Forest Service argued they couldn't release certain documents because they pertained to ongoing wildlife management protocols that were classified for public safety reasons. The judge accepted this argument. The case was sealed. Wildlife management protocols that are classified? Rachel said, that's not normal. Wildlife management is public information. Hunting seasons, bear safety, trail closures. You don't classify that unless the wildlife is something they don't want the public knowing about. In 2013, we got our first real break. A retired FBI agent named Robert Grayson reached out through Rachel's office. He'd heard about our case through law enforcement circles and wanted to meet. We met him at a coffee shop in Olympia. Grayson was in his 70s, looked tired, and chose a table far from other customers. I'm violating several NDAs by talking to you, he began. But I'm old, retired, and frankly disgusted with how these situations are handled. He explained that in his 30 years with the FBI, he'd worked on several missing persons cases in remote federal lands. There's a protocol, he said. Informal, not written down anywhere you'd find it, but consistent. When a missing person case involves witness testimony about bipedal cryptids, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it, there's a specific response chain, which is, first, evaluate the credibility of the witnesses. If they're reliable, experienced outdoors people, law enforcement, park staff, then the case gets flagged. Second, evidence that corroborates these claims, tracks, audio recordings, physical trace, gets quietly sequestered. Third, Alternative explanations get emphasized in official reports. Bear activity, mountain lion, disorientation, whatever fits. Fourth, witnesses are discouraged from speaking publicly. Not threatened, just encouraged to keep quiet for the integrity of the investigation. Why? I asked. Why the cover-up? Grayson leaned back. It's not a conspiracy in the X-Files sense. There's no secret warehouse of Bigfoot bodies. It's institutional liability management. Think about it. If federal agencies acknowledge that a large, unidentified primate species exists in national parks and forests, what happens? Every missing person case gets reopened. Every hiking death gets questioned. Families sue. Visitors panic. Congress demands action. Action the agencies can't take because you can't control what you don't understand. So the simpler solution is denial. Not because they don't believe the evidence. Because acknowledging it creates more problems than suppressing it. You're saying they know it exists? I'm saying enough credible evidence has accumulated over decades that continued skepticism requires willful ignorance. And yes, some people in these agencies know. They've seen the evidence. They've read the reports. They've looked at photographs and casts that don't fit any known species. But officially acknowledging it means admitting they've been lying by omission for decades. So they don't. I asked about Michael's case specifically. Grayson pulled out a small notebook. I made some calls after I heard you were asking questions. Your brother's case was flagged in 1989. The deputy's report, the fabric evidence, the hunter's testimony, all of it was reviewed by someone above the Park Service level. Decision was made to seal it, not because they thought it was irrelevant, because they thought it was too relevant. Someone thinks my brother encountered one. Someone thinks your brother's disappearance can't be explained without acknowledging something that officially doesn't exist. So they chose to leave it unexplained. In 2015, I made a decision. If the institutions wouldn't give me answers, I'd find them myself. I'd spent 26 years searching through documents, interviews, legal battles. I'd become an expert in bureaucratic obfuscation, but I'd never done the one thing that might actually matter. I'd never truly gone into the forest looking for what Michael found. I took a sabbatical from my job. I'd been teaching high school biology in Olympia by then, and spent 3 months training. Wilderness survival, tracking, orienteering. I wasn't young anymore. I was 45, but I was determined. I acquired proper equipment, studied maps, and learned everything I could about primate behavior, animal communication, and field biology. In September 2015, exactly 26 years after Michael disappeared, I entered the Olympic backcountry, not as a grieving sister. As a researcher, I spent 6 weeks out there, rotating between established campsites and careful forays into the remote areas where sightings had been reported. I set up trail cameras. I recorded audio. I observed. I waited. For the first 3 weeks, nothing. Just the profound silence of old-growth forest, the drip of moisture from cedar branches, the distant calls of ravens. I began to doubt. Perhaps I'd constructed an elaborate mythology from grief and coincidence. Perhaps the witnesses had all been mistaken. Then, on the night of October 3rd, I heard it. I was camped near the Ho River, about 9 miles from where Michael's tent had been found. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a sound unlike anything I'd heard before. A vocalization that started low, resonant, almost like a foghorn, then rose into something that sounded disturbingly human. Not words, but inflection, emotion. It echoed across the valley, and I felt it in my chest. I lay in my tent, barely breathing, recording on my phone. The call came again, from a different direction. Then another response, more distant. They were communicating. In the morning, I found tracks near my camp, 16 inches long, 5 clear toes, pressed deep into soft earth near the river. The stride length was massive. Whatever had walked past me in the darkness was bipedal and far larger than any human. I followed the tracks. They led deeper into the forest, off any trail, into areas where the canopy blocked most sunlight and the undergrowth grew dense. I moved carefully, marking my path with GPS waypoints, aware that I was now in territory I didn't control. I found a place where the tracks converged with others, a small clearing beside a creek. The ground was disturbed as Webb had described, but in the center of the clearing was something that made my heart stop, a structure, made of branches and moss, woven together in a crude but deliberate dome shape, large enough for something very big to shelter inside. The entrance faced the creek. Around it, scattered bones, deer, elk, salmon carcasses. This was a living site. I didn't enter. Every instinct told me I was trespassing. This wasn't an abandoned camp, this was someone's home. I backed away slowly, camera documenting everything. As I did, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. I turned and saw it, 40 feet away, partially obscured by a massive cedar trunk, standing, watching, 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair that looked coarse and thick, broad shoulders, long arms, proportions that were wrong for anything I'd ever seen. The face was in shadow, but I could see its eyes, dark, intelligent, focused directly on me. We stared at each other. I don't know for how long. I felt no fear. That's what I remember most clearly. I felt observed, evaluated, but not threatened. It was deciding what I was, what I wanted, whether I was a danger. I slowly raised my hands, showing them empty. I don't know why. Instinct. A gesture of non-aggression. The creature tilted its head slightly. An achingly human gesture of curiosity. Then I spoke. Not loudly, just clearly. I'm looking for my brother, Michael Brennan. He was here in 1989. If you know, if you saw, I don't know what I expected. But the creature didn't move, didn't respond, just watched. And then, with a deliberateness that was unmistakable, it stepped backward into deeper shadow and was gone. No crashing through brush, no dramatic exit, just a quiet withdrawal. I stood there for a long time after, shaking, not from fear, from the weight of confirmation. Everything I'd been told was folklore, misidentification, mass delusion. It was real. It existed. It was here. I spent another 2 weeks in the forest, but I never saw it again. I found more tracks, more signs, tree breaks high up, unusual scat, areas where something large had bedded down in the undergrowth, but no more direct encounters. When I emerged from the backcountry in late October, I knew something fundamental. Michael had encountered them. In 1989, he'd stumbled into their territory, seen what I'd seen, and something had happened. An interaction, a confrontation, a tragedy born from mutual misunderstanding. The red fabric found in that clearing, the circling tracks, the vocalizations the hunters heard. I believed now that Michael had been injured somehow. An accident, a fall, a defensive reaction from a creature startled by human presence. And whatever these beings were, they'd responded. Not with malice, with confusion perhaps, or an attempt to help that went wrong. The truth I'd found in the forest wasn't simple. It wasn't closure, it was complexity. An acknowledgement that Michael had died not because he'd been careless or unlucky, but because he'd crossed a boundary between worlds that coexist in silence, and in crossing it, neither side knew how to react. Some questions don't have answers. They have only contexts. And in the profound quiet of the Olympic forest, I'd found the context for my brother's disappearance. He'd met something wondrous and terrible, something that existed in the margins, and the world had closed ranks to pretend it hadn't happened. When I returned from the forest in October 2015, I made a mistake. I was so overwhelmed by what I'd experienced, so certain that documentation would matter, that I contacted a journalist. Her name was Amanda Price, a reporter for the Seattle Times who'd written about unsolved missing persons cases in Washington state. I sent her my recordings, my photographs, my trail camera footage, and a detailed account of my encounter. She was fascinated. She interviewed me for hours, verified my credentials, spoke with my attorney Rachel Kim, and even consulted with a primatologist at the University of Washington who reviewed my evidence and said on record, "These tracks are inconsistent with any known North American species. The audio contains vocalizations that don't match any cataloged wildlife. This warrants serious scientific investigation." The article was scheduled to run in December 2015. It never did. 2 days before publication, Amanda called me. Her voice was strained. "They killed the story," she said. "Editorial decision from above. I've been a journalist for 15 years. I've never had a fully fact-checked, corroborated story pulled at this stage. Who killed it? I don't know specifically, but I know my editor received calls. Multiple calls. From federal sources, from Park Service Council, from people who made it clear that publishing this story would have consequences. Not legal consequences, but access consequences, cooperation consequences, the kind that affects our ability to report on federal agencies going forward. They threatened the paper. They applied pressure. That's how it works. No one says, "Don't publish this or else." They say, "We're concerned about misinformation." We're concerned about public safety. We're concerned that this could inspire dangerous behavior from cryptid enthusiasts flooding the national parks. They position themselves as responsible adults and you as reckless. And media organizations, especially in this era, can't afford to lose federal cooperation. I asked if she could publish it independently, online, anywhere. She said she'd tried. Every outlet I pitched it to passed. Not because they didn't believe the evidence, because they didn't want the headache. This kind of story attracts the wrong attention. Conspiracy theorists, hoaxers, skeptics who'll tear it apart. And mainstream media doesn't want to be the platform that legitimizes Bigfoot. It's professional poison. My evidence, the most documented encounter in my 26-year search, went nowhere. But the response from federal agencies was immediate. In January 2016, I received a formal letter from the National Park Service. It informed me that based on my unauthorized research activities in Olympic National Park, my future backcountry permits would be subject to additional review for compliance with park regulations. It cited concerns about disturbance of wildlife, establishment of unauthorized surveillance equipment, my trail cameras, and activities inconsistent with wilderness preservation mandates. I wasn't banned, but I was flagged. Every permit application I submitted afterward was delayed, questioned, or denied for technical reasons. Rachel Kim filed complaints on my behalf. "They're retaliating," she said. "You didn't violate any regulations. You had proper permits. You practiced leave no trace. You didn't harass wildlife. This is punishment for finding something they didn't want found." She submitted formal grievances. They went nowhere. We contemplated a lawsuit but faced a cruel reality. I couldn't prove retaliation without proving what I was being retaliated for, and proving the existence of an undocumented species in federal courts was a non-starter. The harassment was subtle, but persistent. In 2017, I received a visit from two men who identified themselves as Department of the Interior investigators. They asked to interview me about my research methodology in the Olympics. They were polite, professional, and deeply unsettling. They asked about my equipment, my observations, my contacts with other researchers. They asked if I'd shared my evidence with anyone besides Amanda Price. When I asked why this mattered, they explained that unverified wildlife claims could create public safety issues if they encouraged reckless tourism in remote areas. "You're investigating me for trying to find out what happened to my brother?" "We're ensuring compliance with federal land management protocols, Ms. Brennan." They left after 2 hours. I felt watched afterward, monitored. Whether that was paranoia or reality, I couldn't say. But I knew they were documenting me now. I'd gone from victim's family member to person of interest. Other researchers I'd connected with reported similar experiences. David Chen, the former park employee, told me in 2018 that he'd been questioned about his interactions with me. Marcus Webb, the hunter from 1989, received a visit from Forest Service personnel asking about statements he'd made to third parties about historical incidents. The message was clear. Stop talking, stop looking, stop asking. Robert Grayson, the retired FBI agent who'd helped us, died in 2017. His death was ruled natural causes, heart failure. But when I tried to obtain copies of materials he'd shared with us, his family said federal agents had visited after his death and collected sensitive documents related to his former work. Whether our case materials were included, they didn't know. The institutional response wasn't dramatic. There were no black helicopters, no overt threats, just consistent, quiet suppression, permits denied, stories killed, witnesses discouraged, evidence lost, a systematic effort to ensure that what existed in the Olympic wilderness remained officially non-existent. By 2019, I'd reached an impasse. I had evidence, I had testimony, I had first-hand experience, but I had no platform, no support, no institutional acknowledgement. The truth existed in the margins, and the system was designed to keep it there. I'd found what happened to Michael. I'd confirmed the presence of an undocumented species. I'd documented institutional suppression, and none of it mattered because the world wasn't ready to accept what the forest had always known. Some truths are too disruptive, too expensive, too complicated, so they get buried under bureaucracy and skepticism and the weight of institutional inertia. My brother's case remains officially unsolved. The Olympic wilderness remains officially safe, and somewhere in those ancient forests, something walks between the trees that we've agreed to pretend doesn't exist. In 2020, during the pandemic lockdowns when the world grew quiet and the forests emptied of tourists, I received an unexpected package. No return address. Postmarked from Portland, Oregon. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. Your brother saw them. He documented them. This is his legacy. What you do with it is your choice. A friend of truth. The USB contained files dated August 1989, Michael's field journal, scanned pages in his distinctive handwriting, and photographs. Dozens of photographs taken in the days before he disappeared. I sat at my kitchen table and read my brother's final thoughts. The journal entries started normal. Scientific observations about forest ecology, tree species, fungal networks. Michael had been studying old-growth ecosystem dynamics for his thesis, but around August 20th, the tone changed. Found tracks today that don't match any reference in my field guides. Bipedal. Massive. I'm following them northeast, away from the main trail. This could be significant. August 21st. The tracks lead to what I can only describe as a territory marker. Trees stripped of bark in vertical patterns, too high for bears. Branches broken at angles that suggest deliberate arrangement. I'm camping nearby tonight. Setting up camera traps. August 22nd. Heard vocalizations last night. Long, resonant calls. Nothing in my audio references matches them. This morning, found more tracks near my camp. Whatever this is, it's aware of me. It's watching. The entries grew more detailed and more excited. Michael had found what he thought was a family group. Evidence of multiple individuals, different sizes, moving through the forest together. He described bedding sites, feeding areas, paths worn through undergrowth. August 24th. I saw one, just for a moment, larger than any primate should be. Dark hair, human-like posture, but the proportions are wrong. I'm not afraid. I'm amazed. This is the discovery of the century. The photographs corroborated everything. Tracks, tree markings, and one image, slightly out of focus, shot from a distance through tree cover, of a large, dark figure standing beside a cedar. The scale was undeniable. This was no human in a costume. The final entry was dated August 25th. I'm going to try for closer contact. I know the risks. But if I can establish non-threatening observation, if I can document behavior without disturbing them, I think they're intelligent. I think they're curious about me too. This could change everything we understand about hominid evolution, about what's possible in modern ecosystems. If I don't come back, I hope someone finds this. I hope someone continues the work. There were no entries after August 25th, but there were 3 more photographs on the USB, time-stamped August 26th. The camera must have been on automatic, triggered by motion. The first showed the clearing I'd later learned about, the one where Michael's torn shirt was found. In the image, Michael was visible, sitting on a log, his camera in his hands. He wasn't alone. 3 large figures stood at the edge of the clearing. Adults, watching him. The image quality wasn't perfect, but their presence was undeniable. The second photograph was chaotic, blurred motion, as if the camera had been knocked or dropped. Shapes moving, confusion. The third photograph was the last. It showed the forest floor, the camera lying on its side, and in the frame a massive hand, covered in dark hair with thick fingers and a broad palm, reaching toward the lens. Then nothing. The camera had either been damaged or deliberately turned off. I stared at these images for hours. Michael had made contact. He'd achieved what no researcher had documented, and something had gone wrong, not necessarily through malice. The images didn't show aggression, but through miscommunication, through fear, through the impossibility of 2 intelligent species encountering each other without protocol or understanding. Had Michael been injured in the interaction? Had he panicked? Had they panicked? The clearing, the circling tracks, the fabric torn high up. It suggested chaos, confusion, an attempt perhaps to help or understand. And then, Michael was gone. I wondered who had kept this evidence for 30 years. Who had Michael sent it to, or who had found it after? And why release it now to me anonymously? I contacted Rachel Kim. She looked at the files, verified the metadata, consulted with digital forensics experts. Everything checked out. These were authentic, unmanipulated files from 1989. You have proof, Rachel said. This is exactly what you've been searching for. But I sat with that proof for weeks, unsure what to do. Michael's journal, his photographs, they answered my questions. They confirmed my theories. They vindicated 26 years of searching. They also put me at a crossroads. If I released these files publicly, what would happen? Media frenzy, certainly. Skeptics would call them hoaxes. Believers would vindicate them. Scientists would demand investigation. The Park Service would deny, deflect, suppress. And somewhere in the Olympic forest, creatures that had existed in silence for millennia would become targets. Tourists flooding the backcountry with cameras. Hunters looking for trophies. Researchers setting traps. The government possibly responding with containment capture, or worse. Michael had written about the risks. He'd understood that discovery came with consequences. I thought about what I'd seen. That moment of eye contact with a being that was aware, intelligent, and choosing to remain hidden. The shelter by the creek. The careful tracks avoiding human trails. These weren't monsters. They were survivors. The last remnants of something ancient, persisting in the margins because we'd left them no other choice. I thought about Robert Grayson's words. Acknowledging them meant admitting decades of lies. It meant chaos, liability, institutional crisis. But it also meant exposure for creatures who'd survived precisely because we didn't believe in them. In October 2020, I made my choice. I encrypted Michael's files and stored them in multiple secure locations. I documented their contents thoroughly. I wrote out everything I knew, a complete record of my search, my findings, my encounter. And I sealed it all with instructions to my attorney. Release upon my death, or release if something happens to suppress this case further, but don't release now. I chose silence. Not because I didn't have proof, because I did. And I understood what Michael had understood too late. Some discoveries are too dangerous for the discovered. It's 2024 now. I'm 63 years old. I still live in Washington, still close to the Olympics. I hike occasionally, but not in the deep places anymore. I've made my peace with the forest's secrets. Michael has been gone for 35 years. The official case remains closed. Death by misadventure in wilderness. Body never recovered. I stopped fighting for official recognition years ago. Some battles can't be won through institutional channels, but I haven't stopped working. Quietly, carefully, I've connected with others like me. Families of missing persons in remote wilderness areas. Researchers who've encountered evidence that can't be published. Rangers who've seen things they can't report. We form a network. Unofficial, unorganized, but persistent. We share information. We document. We remember. There are patterns. Hundreds of missing person cases in national parks and forests across North America that share common features. Experienced hikers vanishing in good weather. Evidence suggesting organized movement of bodies. Witness testimony dismissed as unreliable. Cases closed without adequate explanation. And in a significant percentage, mentions of tracks, vocalizations, sightings that get scrubbed from official reports. The missing 411 phenomenon, documented extensively by former law enforcement, shows clusters of disappearances in areas known for cryptid sightings. The correlation is undeniable if you're willing to look. But institutional acknowledgement remains impossible because it would unravel too many narratives about safety, control, and humanity's mastery of the wilderness. I've learned to live with paradox. I know these beings exist. I've seen them. I've documented them. But I also know that public exposure wouldn't save them. It would endanger them. The only protection they have is our disbelief. Our institutional refusal to acknowledge them creates a buffer zone where they can persist. Michael understood something profound in those final days. He wrote in his journal, "Maybe the point isn't to reveal everything we discover. Maybe some mysteries serve a purpose. Maybe the forest keeps its secrets because we're not ready for the responsibility that comes with knowing." He was right. We're not ready. We haven't proven we can coexist responsibly with the species we do acknowledge. Wolves, bears, bison, all pushed to margins, managed, controlled, killed when convenient. What would we do with a large primate species that's intelligent, elusive, and occupies territory we've designated for recreation and resource extraction? I think about the institutional response to my search, the suppression, the intimidation, the systematic erasure of evidence. It's easy to frame that as conspiracy or corruption, but I've come to understand it differently. It's institutional paralysis. These agencies know something exists that they can't explain, can't control, and can't acknowledge without admitting decades of evasion. So they maintain the status quo through bureaucratic inertia. In 2022, I finally met Deputy Dale Patterson. He's retired now, living in Port Townsend. We sat on his porch overlooking the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and he told me what he'd never told anyone officially. "I saw one," he said. "3 years after your brother disappeared, I was on patrol in the backcountry, responding to a reported illegal hunting camp. As I hiked in, I came around a bend, and there it was, standing on the trail, 9 feet tall if it was an inch, just standing there looking at me. We stared at each other for maybe 15 seconds. Then it stepped off the trail and disappeared into the forest. Didn't run, didn't seem afraid, just left. Why didn't you report it?" "I did. Filed a report, same as I did in '89 about the hunter's statement and the fabric. My captain called me into his office, asked me if I was feeling stressed, suggested I take some time off. When I insisted I'd seen what I'd seen, he explained that reports like mine complicated ongoing management protocols, and that the department couldn't afford to have deputies filing unverifiable wildlife claims. He didn't say I was lying. He said it didn't matter if I was telling the truth." Patterson leaned back in his chair. "I realized then that there's a whole system designed to filter out inconvenient truths. Not maliciously, just practically. Because truth without context is chaos. And these agencies, Park Service, Forest Service, law enforcement, they can't provide context for something that officially doesn't exist. So they choose institutional stability over individual testimony. Every time." I asked if he regretted not pushing harder. He thought about it for a long time. "I regret your brother died," he said finally. "I regret that his case became part of this machinery of denial. But do I regret not forcing the issue about what lives in those forests? No, because I've thought about it for 30 years and I can't figure out what good it would do. The creatures would become spectacles. The forests would become zoos. And people like your brother, who approach them with wonder instead of fear, would still be at risk. Maybe more so because tourism and curiosity would flood those areas." He looked at me directly. "You've kept his evidence secret. I think that's wise. We've made our choice, those of us who know. We carry the burden of knowledge without the release of revelation. We protect something that doesn't know it needs protection by maintaining the very skepticism that once frustrated us. Sometimes I imagine Michael out there still, not physically but in some other way. His curiosity and his respect preserved in the silence of the forest, his photographs and his words sealed away, a testament to what humanity could be if we approached mystery with humility instead of conquest. The Olympic wilderness remains. The creatures remain. The mystery remains. And perhaps that's as it should be. There are still places in this world where the unknown persists, where the boundaries of human knowledge end not because we can't discover what's beyond them, but because we finally learned not to, where silence is maintained not out of ignorance, but out of wisdom. My brother found one of those places. He paid the ultimate price for curiosity, but his legacy isn't tragedy. It's understanding. The understanding that some truths are too dangerous to speak, not because they threaten us, but because we threaten them. I visit his memorial in the Seattle cemetery every year on his birthday. The headstone reads, "Michael Brennan, 1966-1989, lost to the wilderness, found in memory." What it doesn't say, what only I know, is that he wasn't lost. He was transformed, from seeker to lesson, from curious student to cautionary tale about the price and responsibility of discovery. 35 years ago, my brother walked into the forest searching for truth. He found it. And that truth has kept me searching ever since. Not for evidence, but for the wisdom to know when truth should remain unspoken. The forest keeps its secrets because we've finally learned to let it.